Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the role that Mexican Americans played during the Civil War. We already talked a little bit about Juan Cortina and how he supported the North, the Union forces during the Civil War. So let's start off in California. In California, you had a number of Anglo-Americans migrating to the state, right? I had mentioned during the Gold Rush, etc. A lot of these individuals actually came from Texas or other southern areas. So when the Civil War was starting, people were unsure whether California was going to support the South and break away from the Union, or if they were going to stay in the United States. Obviously because you have a lot of Southerners living in California, there's a lot of maybe support for the South, but eventually California takes its official stance of neutrality on the issue of slavery. So California doesn't become a slave state, and California remains in the Union when the Civil War breaks out. It doesn't side with the Confederate States. Eventually, Mexican Americans will join the war effort during the Civil War. Many will be a part of the 1st Battalion of the Native Cavalry of California, and they will take part in a number of battles during the Civil War in the Southwest. Another thing that was occurring during the Civil War was Indian wars that were happening in Northern California. Some Mexican Americans took part in various militias that fought against Native Americans who were conducting raids on Anglo-Americans in Northern California. Of course, as more and more Anglo-Americans moved into Northern California, they started to claim lands which were also claimed by various Native American tribes, and so the tribes were retaliating from this land loss by conducting raids on Anglo-Americans. But during the Civil War, eventually you'll have Anglo-Americans as well as some Mexican Americans joining with militias to fight against Native Americans, in many cases murdering a number of Native Americans and taking their lands there in Northern California. Right? So this was also happening during the Civil War. Now let's move on to New Mexico and take a look at what is happening during the Civil War in that area. Before we get started with this slide, let's go ahead and take a look at a map of some of the battles that took place in New Mexico. And so Texas is right here on the border with New Mexico, and Texas is one of the states who broke away from the Union and joined the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. And so you had Confederate soldiers in Texas who were planning to invade New Mexico, the New Mexico Territory, and take it over. And so you had a Confederate force under John Baylor who took over the southern New Mexican town of Mesilla. All right, and so you have a Confederate victory here at Mesilla, and the plan was that Confederate forces would eventually take over all of the New Mexico territory. And the reason why they wanted to take over New Mexico was so that they could lead a number of expeditions from New Mexico to eventually take over their main targets, which were Colorado and California. And the reason why they wanted Colorado and California was because of the gold fields in those areas. And so that would have been a huge source of income for the Confederate States of America. And so the plan was take New Mexico, then eventually from New Mexico you could lead forces to take Colorado and California. And so John Baylor would lead that force into southern New Mexico, capture the town of Mesilla, and then eventually you would have the Union soldiers of the North starting to try to recruit Mexican Americans to fight against the Confederates before they can take New Mexico. Now remember, a lot of these Mexican Americans in New Mexico were losing their lands. Many of them were impoverished and working as peons on the lands of wealthy Mexican Americans, the Ricos, as well as some Anglo-Americans. And so why would they want to join the Union Army? Why would they want to help the North fight back against the Confederates? Well, there were several incentives that led them to join the Union Army. One was patriotism, right? Don't you have any honor of where you're from? These people are trying to invade your territory and take you over. You should act as a patriot, right? You are an American citizen now. So they were basically trying to reach out to Mexican Americans and try to get a sense of patriotism out of them. Another thing that brought them into the Union Army was they were promised bounties or higher pay pay so if they joined the Union Army. Some Mexican Americans were promised that if they joined the Army, then they wouldn't have to be peons anymore. They wouldn't be tied to the lands of ranchers in New Mexico, and so that brought them into the Union Army as well. But one of the most important things that brought them in was their hatred for Texans. And remember, those Confederate soldiers were mostly Texans who were invading the New Mexico territory and attempting to take it over. And so because of all these reasons, you have Mexican Americans joining the Union Army and fighting back against this Confederate force that was invading New Mexico. Let's take a closer look at what happens in New Mexico. Eventually, Baylor and his men will start moving north to take over all of New Mexico. There will be the Battle of Valverde with Union forces, including Mexican Americans who fought in that battle, and they fought well. Eventually, Confederate forces will go up north, and there will be a major battle at Glorieta Pass outside of Santa Fe. And in this battle, you're going to have a number of Mexican Americans participating. All right. So here on this slide, I'm just showing you that there were a number of Mexican Americans who did join the New Mexico regiments. Right. They were part of the Union Army. A lot of times they weren't working under great conditions. They had suffered because they didn't have enough clothes, they didn't have enough food supplies, they didn't have a lot of good equipment when you're fighting a war, but still they fought on, and they fought well anyway. Okay. Another thing that Mexican Americans who had joined the Union Army had to deal with was racism from Anglo-Americans who were in the Army. And so a lot of times they would look down on Mexican Americans. They would call them greasers. They would use racial stereotypes, saying that they were lazy, that they couldn't fight. But many times Mexican Americans proved them wrong, as they fought very well. As I mentioned earlier, they fought well in the Battle of Valverde, as well as in the most significant battle in the New Mexican territory, and that's the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Okay. Part of the reason why Mexican Americans did so well was because many of them had experience during their wars with Native American groups. Remember, we had talked about there was conflict between New Mexicans and Native Americans. There was raiding, there was retaliation, going back and forth, and this led to experience in battle and in warfare. Maybe not the same kind of battle that happened during the Civil War, but still it's battle experience. And so you have Mexican Americans with some battle experience participating in the war, fighting on the side of the North in the Union Army. And so finally, the greatest battle in the New Mexican territory was the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Mexican Americans played a pivotal role in this battle. There was Colonel Manuel Antonio Chavez. This is Chavez here. Chavez, who played a major part in this battle. He led a group that attacked the supplies of Confederate soldiers there at Glorieta Pass and was responsible for destroying those supplies. And without those supplies, Confederate troops were forced to retreat and eventually leave the New Mexican territory. So the Battle of Glorieta Pass completely destroyed the plans of the Confederates to take New Mexico and eventually take Colorado and California. Didn't happen. None of that happened because of the battle at Glorieta Pass, and Mexican Americans played a very important role in that defeat of the Confederate Army.